anyway. So I think we'll start. Obviously, we're recording. Hope everyone's happy with that. And we're going to sort of structure the talk. Okay, people are coming in the following way. I'm going to give a short introduction, and then each of the artists in the current exhibition is going to say a bit about their work and or experience of coming to this place in the middle of England called Leicester or Leicestershire. Then I would like to introduce another artist who's going to be joining the collection, Dave Everitt, and he'll say a little bit about his work. And then I'd like to open it to a more general discussion. One thing I really want to get out of today is I would like pointers on who else to be speaking to. So any other artists you think maybe I should be talking to about being involved in this project, be it as a contributing artist or as somebody maybe who's got interesting stories and or narratives relating to the work we're talking about. If you think of anyone as you go along, please do let me know at the end who I should be talking to. So I'm just going to now introduce Leicester, because sort of one thing to do would be to assume that everybody knows where Leicester is and where Leicestershire is, and maybe most of you do, but I wouldn't necessarily think that people watching the video necessarily know where Leicestershire is. So let me just flip over to a map. So I have one set up here, and I'm going to share my screen. So I'm going to move over to sharing the screen. There we go. Hopefully you can all see that. So really what we're talking about and what I've been focusing on with this project is looking at art and artists who were based and worked right in the centre of England here. Now, the city is Leicester, but surrounding the city is the county, Leicestershire, which includes towns like Loughborough, and I think Melton. Well, Melton actually, no, Melton's not quite in, but Melton, Mulberry is quite close, and there are other places. Nottingham's not too far away. In fact, Derby's not very far away either. We're right in the centre of the country here. And I've lived in Loughborough for many years. I came here to study, and I've worked at quite a few of the institutions where the other people here are going to mention. So I studied and worked at Loughborough University, and at one point I had an associate. Well, I had a sort of. I used to go to see people at Leicester Polytechnic, and later on I did my PhD at De Montfort University, which took over from Leicester Polytechnic. Was the new name for it. And we also have another university, Leicester University. And we seem to be in quite a sort of privileged location, really. And we've got a high density of high quality institutions, many of them with a strong arts interest. And I was aware that across the institutions, there was a lot of history, digital arts history, that perhaps needed to be collected. But I'm not assuming that all of the artists who are ultimately going to be involved in this project are university-based artists. I'm looking at the historic side of things. So I'm saying, well, what historic digital artwork have we got in this area? And by historic, we're looking right back to the 60s. And I'm certainly aware that for digital artists, accessing computers in those earlier years was difficult. And therefore, you are probably going to find most of the artists were university-based. But certainly when I come to look at more contemporary work in the area, I'm aware that there are lots of independent artists I should be talking to as well. So this is the area, Leicester, in the middle of the UK, for anyone who doesn't know. The project we're talking about is something that I'm doing under the guises of the Computer Arts Society's archive, a project that I've been working on in Leicester, taking the Computer Arts Society's additional materials. I say additional because it's the first wave of materials, as it were, went to the V&A and formed the basis of their excellent digital art collection. But I'm now taking the next wave of materials, probably 2000, mid-2000s onwards, and putting together an archive of those. But I'm also looking at doing small projects within that. One project is to archive the EVA conferences, particularly EVA London, which a number of you may have been involved in. I know you've been involved in, spoken at. So the project is looking to take their archive. We've got their archive. It's to actually give it some structure. I've also got a collection of work, the Micro Arts collection, which was work done in the mid-80s by Jeff Davis. This is interesting. This is artwork made on, I guess for me, computers, the computers that I started working with as a youngster. I wasn't really making what I would call art with them. I made images, but I didn't see them as artworks. I just saw them as fun. But Jeff was actually doing some great work back in the day there, using the ZX Spectrum BBC Micro to make artwork. So I've collected some of that work. We also have a collection which we call the CAS 50 collection, which was really put together as a way of celebrating 50 years of the Computer Art Society. And a number of the artists here, I think all of the, in the first 4, were featured in this collection, because when I wanted to put together this collection to help celebrate the Computer Art Society, I obviously went to people I knew, and a number of those people were connected to Leicester and Leicestershire. This collection is growing, and over time, I think it will become quite significant. So this project is like one of my little side projects related to the Computer Arts Archive, and it's trying to make, like I mentioned, it's trying to really capture some of the histories of digital art in the area in which I live. So I've briefly introduced Leicester and spoken a little bit about the Computer Arts Archive. Like I say, the project is focused on this area, and really it's very hard not to talk about digital arts in Leicester without talking about Ernest Edmonds. I would draw my starting point really being Ernest and Stroud Cornock at Leicester Polytechnic in the late 60s, as being really where Leicester in particular began to work. Leicester digital artists began, and work was coming out of the city that was highly relevant, innovative digital artworks. So the first speaker is going to be Ernest. I'll give Ernest the full 10 minutes. We're not going to try and cut it short because I started a bit late. And then we'll move on to 3 people who are all actually students of Ernest's. Steve Scrivener will talk about his work. He was based at Leicester Polytechnic twice during his career. We'll also then move on to Stephen Bell, who was based at Loughborough University, working with Ernest. And then I'll talk a little bit about my own work, which is back to Leicester at De Montfort University, and I studied under Ernest as well. And then I'll also introduce one more artist who'll give a little short overview. He's the next artist in the collection, and that's going to be Dave Everitt. So that's what I plan to do. I would just say that the exhibition that I put on in Leicester, it was in a space called Beta X, which is a community art space that I'm involved in on Churchgate in Leicester, not far from the centre, but Churchgate is an area that needs investment, and the council thought that a way of helping to develop the area would be to support the development of a community art space. And I thought a good thing to do would be to put an exhibition of work by artists who were from or worked in Leicester. And that exhibition has just come down, but it features work by Ernest, Stephen Scrivener and Stephen Bell and myself. And this web address up here at interactdigitalarts.uk contains some notes that I put together for the exhibition, and then photographs of the work that we put up, including this fantastic set of prints from Stephen Scrivener, work by Stephen Bell, and of course work by Ernest. And I'll briefly mention a little bit of work from myself. So the exhibition has now finished, but this is the first of what I hope will become a growing and regular sort of exhibition of Leicester-based digital artwork. I think already I'm starting to think that I want to put together one maybe towards the end of the year, when I've hopefully contacted a few more artists. And I'd like to also write something to have a little sort of booklet or catalogue talking about this work, and I potentially found a source of funding to help me do that. So they might be the next projects that come along as part of this. But as mentioned, I think the first thing I should do is really hand over to Ernest, who I'm sure he'll explain this, but began his work in Leicester over 50 years ago. And he worked with somebody I think we all regard as a very innovative pioneer as well, who's sadly no longer with us, Stroud Cornock. So Ernest, shall I hand over to you? I'll stop sharing my screen. I can do that by got to find the right, there we go. That should be gone now. So I think you should be able to take over if you like, Ernest.
Okay, I think I'm still seeing your screen, actually.
I'm still seeing your screen as well, Sean. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, there we go. Stop share. I paused it rather than.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you for your project. It's really exciting. Okay, so I thought I would say a little bit about the story more than the art. I came to Leicester rather randomly at the beginning of the 60s to go to Leicester University to study mathematics. And it was both random that it was Leicester and also rather random that I chose to study mathematics. But it was quite good because the head of department there was a very fine logician, and that got me into mathematical logic and the philosophy of mathematics. And secondly, because he persuaded me to do a subsidiary course in philosophy. And I became friendly with the philosophy staff, and they came to understand that I was much more interested in art than in mathematics, and introduced me to people at the College of Art running the foundation course. And they were very good. It was an extremely high profile, excellent course. And so that made Leicester interesting to me. So I hung around, and to cut a long story short, I ended up working at what was then, when I started, the Leicester Technical College, I think it was called. I worked as a research assistant in mathematics. And then again, rather randomly, within a year, the head of department knocked on my door and said, basically, we've got a lectureship in computer science going, would you like it? And I think I had taught myself to write a program, and I could spell computer, so that meant I was qualified to be a lecturer in computing, apparently. So this was in the mid to late 60s. And obviously so I had this job. It's quite a nice kind of job, quite interesting, but I tried to think, how would I make it interesting? And a few things happened. One was I decided to see, well, was this stuff any use in art? And I got some final year undergraduate computer science students working on support systems for artists. And I won't tell you the whole story, but just to say we found a lot of interesting things that changed the direction of how I thought computer science should go. So this interest in art was influential on computer science. And in fact, the things that I did then, which were thought to be very improper, are now standard run-of-the-mill things in computer science. So it was very much the right direction. But more interestingly, and I'll share my screen to explain this. In the late 60s, I made this relief piece, and the piece itself doesn't matter for the story we're telling here, except two things about it. One is that it's sprayed, right? And not painted with a brush. And so I went to the School of Art, which was then a separate institution, but right next door, to find out whoever it was who ran the spray booth there to see if they could help me. And I found this guy running the spray booth. His name was Stroud Cornock. And he helped me finish this work with the spray booth. But when I explained to him that I actually wrote a computer program to help me decide on where each of those pieces would be, he got very excited because he'd started a sort of new media unit within the School of Art. And he started it because he had a background of working with Roy Ascott, and that had been an influence on him, right? And so Stroud and I became very good friends, and not only friends, but partners in the enterprise of trying to work out what computers would do for art. So this was the start of it for me. Of course, this was happening, as a matter of fact, in 1968. And I think you'll all know that cybernetic serendipity was on at that year as well. So it was all very kind of hot stuff. And Stroud and I went to the Computer Graphics Conference in 1970, which had sections of it organized by the Computer Art Society, which we had both joined. And we presented this paper, The Creative Process Where the Artist is Amplified, or, quotes, perhaps superseded by the computer, at this conference. And it was a kind of manifesto. And I suppose the key point about it was that we thought interaction was the big thing. But just remember, this was before PCs. This was when basically Leicester Polytechnic had one computer, right? And it was a mainframe computer which would support one user at a time. But nevertheless, looking into the future, we thought this was the way forward. And so that made a big impact on what we did and what came next. And Stroud and I worked together theoretically, but also practically. So we made this piece called Data Pack, which using like a teletype, which people don't mostly know what that is anymore, but it's a kind of computerized typewriter which can type back at you, for the exhibition at Computer Graphics 70, just to demonstrate that interactive art could be made. And so that was really the start. And of course, it was before the technology could really support what we wanted to do, but we were trying to work on the ideas ahead of the availability of the technology. And a couple of years later, I forget, 2, 3, 4 years later, I was very fortunate because the head of my department said, here's this research studentship, and you can have it to support a PhD student if you want. So I said that was great. And what did I do? Well, I thought, well, what I really wanted to do was explore computing in art. So it was a science research council, as it was called then. And so I rang them up and said, well, suppose I use this studentship to support someone to investigate computers in art. Would that be okay? And they said, yes, it will be fine. So I then went to my boss and said, you know, I know you're prejudiced against all that kind of thing. It's not hard science and technology and, you know, all that stuff. But the Science Research Council said it would be all right. So I went ahead and did it. And of course, I talked to Stroud and said, well, have you got any idea? I've got this opportunity. Have you got any idea of anyone who could do this? And he said, well, there was a very fine artist who qualified at Leicester Polytechnic or School of Art, whatever it was at that time, a year or two ago, who went to the Slade. And the Slade, as again, probably everyone knows, at that time had started having a computer available to the postgraduate students. And that person was Stephen Scrivener. So I talked with him and I was very fortunate that he caught the bug, as it were, and agreed to come and work with us. And he did a lot of important work, and he might hopefully talk about that in a few minutes. And that got something going in terms of education. There's a long gap. Lots of things happened. There's a book there by Francesca Franco, who worked for a while at De Montfort University about all the history of what happened. And I also published a book just recently with Margaret Bowden, which covers a lot of this history and so on. And another book that's interesting is this one, because out of what I've just described came the understanding that in order to use this new medium, we had to do research, not just in art, but also in the technology. We had to push the boundaries on both fronts. And that has grown into this practice-based research work. And Craig Veer, now De Montfort University, led the development of this. But it all keeps going and it's all different. And I will just spend the last 1 minute or so that I've got saying the last thing I've done. So I was at Leicester University, then I was at Leicester Polytechnic. I went off to Loughborough University, as Sean has already said. Then I slipped off to Sydney for a while. And then I was persuaded to come back to De Montfort University, which was quite nice because it was like closing the circle, going back, finishing up where I'd started. And so the latest thing I've done with the Art AI Festival here is this work, which connects together two components, two interactive components, one in Leicester and one in Dubai in the expo there in the British Pavilion. And so what we see here is an interactive work where people interact with it in each location, and the two locations interact with one another, bringing together Dubai and Leicester. So I'm not wanting to talk about this work, I'm just wanting to say that the things continue, and all this stuff tends to be collaborative, working with other people. And I think the community that Sean is trying to bring together and record is really what I find most exciting about it all. I'll stop.
Great. Thank you very much. Fascinating. And that story about how you almost randomly met up with Stroud, I hadn't heard that before. I didn't realise that he was in charge of the spraying area. And so,
No.
Yeah. You wonder what would happen to our lives if these random events didn't happen, because they sometimes such significant things happen. You can't quite really, you don't imagine at the time just how they're going to work out. I can certainly think of a number of occasions actually in my career, certainly, where those things have happened. So the next person will be Stephen Scrivener. So for me, I'll just sort of say, Steve, well, actually, no, I'll save my bit until I talk about my bit. What I'll do, I will just hand over to Steve, and he can almost like pick up, as it were, from where you finished off talking about some of the local things that were happening.
Okay, so yeah, so basically I do much the same as Ernest has done, really, and just focus on the narrative, really, just I guess to sort of give something of the history and the connection. So yes, I ended up in Leicester in 1969. I just completed a pre-diploma course, which is what is now called Foundation. I'd completed a pre-diploma course, as it was called then, at Banbury, and I guess it wasn't quite random. It was just that Leicester accepted me. So you could go to about three polytechnics, and you showed your work, produced a portfolio of work, you showed your work. You usually interviewed, almost all of you were interviewed, and Leicester chose me. But I like Leicester anyway. I like the idea of Leicester. I went to Leicester as a painter, actually, but I was already having trouble with painting, just because I wasn't comfortable with composition. I wasn't even comfortable with construction. So I guess I was sort of looking to find other ways in which you might actually think about making art. And it was a pretty interesting course to start, actually. They had a lot of really interesting staff. For example, actually, probably one of the most influential was a guy called Gavin Bryars. And I don't know how many of you know, but he's I guess a modern or contemporary composer. He was really sexy because he'd studied with John Cage. So and he had all these pictures, kind of John Cagey looking pictures from the Black Mountain College and stuff like that. So he appealed to us because of that connection, but also he was a really interesting bloke. He was a Buddhist, and he was just really interesting. There was an artist called Jack Rodway, who was experimental, and of course there was Stroud. But there were others at Leicester as well. There was Sue Tebby, Alan Welsford, Colin Jones, who was quite an influence because he was a systems artist, printmaker Mike Hale, and there was a painter called Mike Hoare. So it was a pretty interesting department. I went there in '69. I wasn't connected with Ernest at all, except I do remember actually going to a one-day event that Ernest organised with Stroud. And I think it was actually talking about computer art, but I can't quite remember. I wasn't into computer art. What I did at Leicester in this experimental department was to produce work that was based around natural processes. So I used light and I used water as a mediums, and then I sort of constructed environments in which the mediums would interact. So in my final year show, I had a set of tanks with baffles in them, and water dripped into these tanks, and it was reflected off the surface of the water onto a big screen. And also I had a couple of light pieces. One was interactive, so you walked through a space, and in that space there were screens, and onto those screens were projected colours, and as you walked through you'd interrupt the colours, so you would partly construct the artwork. So I was already interested in process, and I was already interested in interaction when I actually left Leicester and started at the Slade in 1972. So I was at the Slade from 1972 to 74. Whenever I moved from one place to another, I always had a kind of crisis. So I struggled to know what I was actually going to do next. But I already knew that I was kind of interested in processes as means of actually creating artworks and natural kind of phenomena to a certain extent as the medium they actually worked with. But that was quite difficult to do at Slade. At Leicester, I had this massive studio, literally massive. It was huge. At the Slade, there was nothing. And you just traveled from the Slade to your home and so on. So I had to rethink things. And it was at that point that I also became interested in, I guess, science and the connection between science and technology. I got interested in Ross Ashby and in homeostatic systems. And I wanted to actually produce work that was based around these homeostatic systems. And that's when I first began to get involved in computing. So I started to write my first program there. Can't remember what language it was in. It was probably in Fortran. And my final year show was all computer based. So I don't know whether you can show it, Sean. You might just show the image of the machine. I constructed this machine. It was hardware, totally hardware. I was greatly supported by a chap called Chris Briscoe, who was the technician. What I joined at the Slade was the experimental department. I was in the first cohort, and I think there are only about 3 or 4 cohorts, and it was run by Malcolm Hughes. And Chris was really the manager of our lab, but quite brilliant. He was an artist, but he was quite brilliant with electrical systems and stuff like that, electronics. And a great bloke to work with, and he helped me enormously in actually building this device. And at the same time, so this device was the embodiment, if you like, of a homeostatic system. So you would interact with it. It was basically a square. You had 4 units that you could actually set a value on. And once you set it going, you're basically disturbing this thing, and it would eventually go back to equilibrium, and equilibrium was a square. And that was 1974 that piece was in the show, together with the drawings that went with it. Recently, when I was thinking what to send to Sean, I discovered that all of the drawings had actually gone to the V&A. So I don't have any of those other than in images, but they're all available in the V&A collection. Ernest can probably answer the question. Well, I think he's answered the question in a certain extent, but when I finished in 74, I think that's when Ernest actually, I don't actually quite recall when Ernest contacted me. But I do remember going up actually, I think in July or something like that. And Robert, his son, was just this lovely little 2-year-old child with absolutely blonde hair, rolling around on a little, what would you call it? A sort of a little sort of truck bike sort of thing, wasn't it? Child's bike. And I met Ernest in his garden, which Ernest quite likes to do that. You meet in a quite nice environment, usually with wine or something like that. And I don't think I needed much persuading to go up, because I saw this as a great opportunity to actually find myself in a computer science department, undertaking a PhD, and seeing that as ways of actually developing my computer art. And of course, Ernest and I then worked very closely together, well, as student and supervisor, but then subsequently as lecturers. I was a lecturer in the computer science department, and then we went together to Loughborough afterwards. During that period, I produced quite a number of pieces of computer art-based work, which all of it's available actually to look at on my website. But I guess I stopped making computer art in around about 1984. I don't think I was quite so committed, certainly not so committed to computers or computing as Ernest and Sean, for example. So my work is much more diverse now, but I think it's still shaped by the same things. You know, some of it's interactive, almost all of it is process or rule-based. Yeah, and that's where I am at present, and my recent work is up there as well. And I'm working in both directions, both in abstract, in an abstract way, but also in a figurative way as well. So that's really my story. Our story went on at Loughborough, and then of course Sean came into my life, so he'll probably talk about that connection when he now goes on to talk about his.
Great. I've just shared a link actually to a page on your website that has the machine, or the piece, all the wiring and so on. It looks amazing, yeah. And there's a short...
I can't believe I built it. I don't know how I learned the stuff to do it, but I've certainly forgotten it all.
Again, really sort of fascinating to hear how the stories connect and your interests and so on. Now you mentioned the move from Leicester to Loughborough, and that was really where I first became aware of this exciting group of researchers, because it happened the same time that I went to Loughborough University to study computing. And so you'll probably tell a better story, but what was the HCIRUG, Human Computer Interaction Research
Unit? HCIRU, wasn't it?
That literally moved from Leicester Polytechnic to Loughborough and became LUCHI. Is that right, Ernest? Is that sort of a fair way of describing what happened?
Yeah, that's right. I think about 20 people moved from Leicester Polytechnic to Loughborough University. It was a strange thing. Not everyone at Leicester Polytechnic was pleased with me, but there we are.
They've obviously forgiven me, haven't they?
And so really, so for me, this happened while I was an undergraduate, and I'd always had a strong interest in, well, I wouldn't have even called it computer art, computer graphics, I guess. I used to write programs in the computers to generate graphical images and so on. And then to be in a department where this was now a big part of what people did was very exciting. And one of those people who studied there, who I got to know, is our next speaker, Stephen Bell, who is down in Bournemouth, I believe, and is going to talk maybe a little bit about his experience now at Loughborough University, not Leicester University. I'm hoping Stephen is all right there.
Just
remembering to unmute.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it's great to be able to do this. I'm just going to get my screen up, hopefully, so I can make sure I get the right screen. So share that and get the show working. Okay, so I thought I'd tackle this by looking at how and why I ended up in Leicestershire. Before I got to Leicester, I was working down in the University of Kent at Canterbury, and I'm just got to move the picture of all you guys because it's covering over my notes. Right, okay. So I was due to finish a residency at the University of Kent at Canterbury Computing Laboratory, and was looking for a way to continue to get financial support and access to computer technology. So I could continue what I decided would be a 10-year exploration of the possibility of making interactive computer art. I say the possibility. My reason for doubt about its viability was that after the late 60s to early 70s, when there were things like cybernetic serendipity, interactive art seemed to have vanished from the art world's critical attention. It was probably going on. It wasn't You know, we had no web, so it was really hard to know what was going on. But it had gone. So I was, you know, how do you go about it? So at the end of the residency, I'd got a basic algorithm for my work. I was trying to make something that would be worth interacting with. I also kind of anticipated that would probably something that eventually was called VR, virtual reality, but I was thinking about simulators and aircraft simulators and things like this. What would it be worth looking at in these things if they ever became more available to people? So the next step was to animate what I'd made, because at University of Kent, all I could do was get static screens, images, and to see what that revealed to people, and then to make it interactive, to find out what kind of aesthetic effect it would have if you made the work interactive. I really wanted to make interactive works using computer graphics, but wondered whether there was any point if it wasn't getting critical attention. Had the interactive art not really worked as art when it was made in the 60s? Was there any sense in my belief that interactive computer art could be the 21st century art form, in the same way that I saw the 20th century art form as being animation, which of course includes lens-based movies? I've been looking for books on interactive computer art, but as there did not seem to be a book on the subject, I thought I'd have to write it myself, so to speak, and doing a PhD seemed like the best way to research the subject. I contacted Malcolm Hughes, as he'd mentioned someone supporting artists doing PhDs, and I knew that my contemporary from the Slade, Dominic Borum, and previous Slade student Steve Scrivener had done PhDs with this mythical person. So I asked Malcolm who he was, and he put me in touch with Ernest. Ernest had just moved the research centre to Loughborough when I joined as a PhD student. I was supervised by Dr. Susan Tebby of Leicester Polytechnic, and Ernest was my director of research. I hope this research would allow me to access the technology I needed to develop my software, Small World, further. If all went well, it would also mean that I should gain a science qualification, which I hope would grant future access to the latest computer technology, which was usually only available in research labs or commercial companies at the time. And I could be called a doctor, like Doctor Who. I spent several years living in Loughborough and Leicester, studying and working at Loughborough University of Technology, more specifically at LUTCI. And so that's my connection with Leicestershire. So why was it a good thing? Okay, one of the benefits of being at university is the remarkable people you meet and the unexpected, unplanned things that occur. For example, I've just got examples, there are too many to go through all of them. About a year into my research, John Walden brought into the research centre the first two non-commercial silicon graphics workstations in the country. From then on, I could work on what at the time was one of the most advanced interactive computer graphics workstations in the world, next to John and Al Humrich, as they developed their VR system. In fact, I had the pleasure of setting up the two machines because they needed one for each eye. Then, when my grant ran out after a couple of years, Ernest employed me as a research technician, and I was able to experience research practices as people work on part of the ALVI program and other projects. I was able to work with, among others, Mike Smith, Tony Clark, Andre Woodcock, other names that come to mind, Julius Guzzi, whose contribution to student seminars appeared to be every time to ask why in response to any statement. Eddie McDade, Andre Chapeau, and then there were the PhD students I shared an office with, Brendan Ward and Neil Watkinson, and many others. I also met some great local people in my extracurricular activities. While I was at Loughborough, as part of my informal engagement in popular interactive art forms, as I would like to put it, I helped to found a national live action role-play gaming society called Fools and Heroes. There has for a long time been a constructive interplay of ideas between my role-play gaming activities and my artwork. They're all about participation and interactivity and Interestingly, both programming and games rules share a lot in common. Also, it was a great way to enjoy the atmosphere of Leicestershire countryside. So as a boy, I was inspired by what I was told about Leonardo da Vinci. I wanted to grow up to be like him, but how do we spend our lives in a society that insists on categorizing its members? Where do those of us who do not fit neatly into the categories created to classify human activities, for example, scientist or engineer or artist, go? Ernest's research group was perhaps an example of what Donna Cox called a Renaissance team. Perhaps society just needed a new category. Artists doing PhDs has now become an accepted and possibly expected activity. But when I did mine and attended the Business Games week arranged by the body that sponsored the first 2 years of my research, the fact that I was an artist surprised people. It was very exhilarating at the time to be in Leicestershire and in what felt like a beginning of something big. When the LV project and funding ended in 1989, I moved to Bournemouth to work as a lecturer, teaching artists how to use computers while completing my PhD write-up. I reached the end of my decade of inquiry into interactive art while I was at the National Centre for Computer Animation, which I helped to establish here. I've supervised colleagues' PhDs and developed curricula that encouraged research and innovation before innovation became just another category. What I'd learned by working with Ernest and his colleagues about critical research and interdisciplinary cooperation was invaluable. Tony Clark said to me at the time I moved down here something like, "Steve, people who move to Bournemouth never leave. They go there to retire. As I said, you meet some remarkable people." I received my PhD from Loughborough University of Technology in 1991. Steve Scrivener was my internal examiner. Oh, and that's not the only connection with the Leicester. I spent nearly 30 years of my life with Sarah Thompson, who I met later. She was a student of Stroud Cornuck at Leicester Polytechnic during the late 80s. Sarah started using computers in her work a few years after she graduated and has been reviewing, blogging, and writing about digital art for over 20 years. So there's another digital relationship with Leicester. There we go. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much. Actually, I think I will, if it's okay with you, Dave, could I give you a few minutes maybe to talk about your work? Because did you overlap with Steve Bell at all?
No, I came to Loughborough in about 1997, 98, I think it was.
Okay. Well, I think, because I think I can sort of bring a few things together actually in some of the stories or narratives that I have in my work. But yourself, David, another example of an artist brought into a computing department. And you're saying so towards the end of the 90s. So a few years after you left, Steve?
Yeah, well, I left in 89.
Oh, okay. Fair few years. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Dave, if you're okay, maybe just to keep it to 5 minutes. Now, Dave isn't in the exhibition or the recent exhibition, not because of any other reason than I had to move very quickly and I just got in touch with a few people and I put it together. But it's most definitely going to be an important part of the collection as it grows. So I thought it would be good to have Dave Everitt in today and maybe to say a little bit about his work.
Okay, I'll share my screen. Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Okay. Right, so I started at Leicester Polytechnic on a foundation course, pre-diploma as it was called then. And I've always been interested in magic squares as a kind of mathematical hobby, as it were. So that's a drawing I used to do, that kind of thing, before I got into digital art. I'm going to zip through this really quickly. Then I took a sketch that I'd done on Apple's HyperCard to draw the actual lines, but I realized that I needed some help. So I wrote a load of pseudocode and worked with Greg Turner, who was at Loughborough then, under Lucci stroke CCRS, when Ernest was very much a big influence there, and introduced me to people like Paul Brown and Harold Cohen, who were guest speakers, and that really sort of got me going, I guess. And I thought, okay, I hadn't done any drawing for a while. I'd lost interest in exhibitable art, and I wanted to do interactive stuff. And Ernest was very much stressing the idea of the computer as an invisible item, as it were. So that was the first piece that I did with Greg Turner, who was I think he was a master's student at the time, and my coding wasn't up to what was needed at the time. So you can see there, we've hidden completely the computer, and the only input into the artwork, this was, we made this in '98 and constructed it and exhibited it at Loughborough in '99. So the idea was to have no visible computer, but one tiny input, which is the heartbeat monitor, which is down there where you can see my hand. And that was the idea. And later on, I worked with Mike Quantrill, and this basically gave us the run of a couple of rooms where we had a huge whiteboard where we just worked on ideas. These are stills from Cube Life at the time, sort of screenshots from 1999. And I kind of lost interest in trying to make them physical, because the whole idea of the work was for it to be interactive. So I tried to get it sort of working interactively in different environments, which was a little bit of a challenge. And that work carried on until about 2011, when I worked with Greg Turner again. He's somebody that you might want to talk to about that era, actually, because he was very much involved as a student. Linda Candy told me that it might be the first heartbeat-driven interactive artwork. So I quickly stuffed it up on Ada, just in case. And I can't find any other work before then. It was heartbeat-driven, so I was quite sort of happy with that. I didn't aim to be that person, but it just happened out of the influences that were around at the time, and especially Ernest's idea about the invisible computer, getting the interface sort of directly interactive with the audience and losing the idea of a keyboard or anything else like that. Later on, we formed in 2000 the Emergency Art Lab, because I was on various boards and I realized there was a lot of grant money around that wasn't being spent on this kind of work. So we threw together something called 64 Samples, which was shown at part of the Arts Council's Wide and Dangerous series in 2000. I think we did this in about 2 weeks. And we worked on the silicon graphics machine that was there at the time. Mike Quantrill was the person doing most of the code, and we worked heavily together on the structure of how can we get 64 participants to sort of work on a piece that shows their interactions. So what we did was take samples from each person. You can see in the images there. Everybody took a portrait and a little bit of personal data and a sound file, and Pip and Matt Rogalski worked on putting the sound together in such a way that we played it all back, and we performed this live at the conference, basically. I could talk a lot more about the atmosphere at the time, because the kind of environment that Ernest had created at Loughborough was very much productive towards this. It was very easy to come up with new work. I mean, we found our own funding. I think I worked on a Year of the Artist grant that brought in people like Jack Ox and a couple of other artists. There's a whole list of artists, I think about 5 or 7 that we brought in. They were all working together at the time. The technician Andre Chapeau was really helpful. Lucci, the whole environment just promoted this kind of work. This all, oh, there's a screenshot just for nostalgia of I think it's IRIX that was running on the silicon graphics machine at the time. That was the work that we developed this particular piece on. Mike has sort of dropped out of the picture really since then, so it's a little bit sad. And just quickly zipping forward, I'm still working with magic squares with my wife, Fania, and we met at De Montfort at the Institute of Creative Technologies, which is where I went after Ernest had moved to Australia. There's a lot of things that could be said about that era. Pip Greasley is another person who really should be part of the picture here, because he's been producing kind of work, you know, for a long time, and we worked together with him at the Emergency Art Lab, you know, when we formed that. This all happened around, like I said, it all happened around a large room with an interactive whiteboard and a load of back copies of various magazines that informed the process. So that really kind of kick-started things. So coming back to exhibiting stuff now, Sean, the kind of things that you're doing, framed artwork and prints are complete alien territory for me now. And I've had to sort of think about how to start this all over again, you know, how to get this work into a kind of exhibitable format, you know, non-interactive.
Well, I don't just want to exhibit and don't do exhibitions, pictures on walls, but I think it's part of, for me, I see the pictures as the stills being an entry point into the world that I'm exploring. And it's not always possible to set up computers, and certainly to give computers to archives and things like that. So I never thought I'd end up making prints when I started making digital images, but I see it as, these days, I see it as a valuable part of what I do.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important, and it would be really nice to capture that work. I mean, for instance, this piece on the screen was shown for one day and then it disappeared. I've done a lot of work over years to try and bring back some of the stills that we had. And Michael has the machine, I think, that we used to run this on, but getting it up and running and working again in that way, that's the whole, you know, it brings in the whole idea of the legacy technology, you know, that we need to do this.
Yeah,
when I first,
well, that'll bring me on to one thing I was going to finish with as a suggestion for the future. And as part of that, I've actually been working with Ernest and potentially with Steve Scrivener as well about recreating some early works, because they simply are not around anymore for whatever reason. They either got lost or broken, or the technology has moved on, doesn't work. A lot of this early work it's quite easy to have lost some quite important pieces. So I think recreating them might be a valuable thing to do. And that might include making sure we've got a version of CubeLife that runs on a more generic set of technologies and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'll stop sharing that. But yeah, definitely. I mean, that will be of interest. It's been hard to sort of keep things going. I've been through 3 computers with CubeLife, and the last one putzed out, you know, and smelt of horrible smoke the last time I brought it. So it's we can have a chat at some point. Yeah, when you're free to. Are you going out yet, or are you still trying to isolate yourself? Not to crowded indoor spaces.
Yeah, I don't blame you. I got COVID not too long ago, and I thought I was playing it safe, but clearly it wasn't too bad. But even so, I wasn't expecting to get it. Yeah. Okay, so what we'll do now is I'll just talk a little bit about my sort of connection in this, and then I think maybe we should just open it up and have a chat. I'll give you a few suggestions of things that you might want to talk about. So I'm going to share my screen as well. So I thought it might be worth me going last, because even though I wasn't around at the beginning of the story, I joined at a point where things were moving between institutions. So I've actually had a look at, and I've seen how things work in a number of the institutions that are part of this story, a number of the centres that Ernest has been involved in and has set up. So I'm going to share my screen again. All right, let's share that one. Now, probably like everyone, I am looking at archiving my own work or trying to put it together in a form where it might be around potentially for longer than I am. And I have started capturing some of my early work here. I joined Loughborough University in 1984 as an undergraduate student, and I was studying computer, I think it was called Studies or Science. I can't remember if they called it Studies or Science at the time. In what was a traditional computer department when I joined. I wanted to study computing because I'd been fascinated by computers. I liked making images with computers, but for me, the computer that I used, the most sophisticated one, was a BBC Micro, Commodore PET at school. I had my own ZX80 and so on. I thought it might give me access to some more sophisticated machinery. Now, when I first joined Loughborough University, I was surprised to find that there wasn't really a lot in the way of computer graphics. Some of my computer tasks involved me sitting in front of a teletype terminal, and you would type in your program. It would be saved on the mainframe. You'd run it, and then you'd take away your little scroll, hand in as your project. I was sort of a little surprised that this was computer technology that I associated with maybe the 70s or even 60s, and that was actually the basis of what I was using in my computing education. Not that I complained, I got a great education at Loughborough. However, things did start to get rather exciting, and I think it was around 86 or 87 when this group of people from Leicester Polytechnic turned up and formed Leicestershire. Can you confirm the date actually when Leicestershire started, Ernest?
Well, we actually moved in 85.
Oh, okay, yeah.
But I guess it was probably not till 86 that we invented the new name of Leicestershire.
Yeah, I think probably what happened, I did 2 years of my degree, and then I had a sandwich year, and then everything got exciting when I was away. But luckily for me, I had friends up here in Loughborough still, so I went off to Bracknell to work for ICL. In fact, I worked for ICL in the same building as Alan Sutcliffe, who founded the Computer Art Society, but we never met knowingly anyway. So for me, I came back from my industrial year and had this fantastic group of researchers and artists and other people turned up in what I felt was a slightly stuffy computing department. And things got very exciting. And I naturally wanted to do an exciting final year project. And I had the opportunity to do a project with Steve Scrivener. And this was to do with knowledge-based picture interpretation. And it was part of a big project that Lucci had. I think it was part of the sort of associated with the Alvey project, the Alvey funding. And a big element of that was computer vision. And a lot of research was taking place in the department on computer vision. And I got an opportunity to do a project related to that in my final year project. But I also got to sit in front of much more exciting computers that actually had graphical displays. And so the advantage of doing that as my final year project is I got to sit in front of, I think possibly those Silicon graphics, but the ones I most remember were the Hewlett-Packard machines. And they would run Prolog for logic programming. They had what would now be regarded as a low-res screen, but was an incredibly high-resolution screen at the time. And I would make use of these computers for my final year project, but I also would write programs in the evenings. And because you were allowed to use the computers whenever. So I was given a pass to the various rooms and I would be able to sit there in the evenings. And I remember one evening writing a classic fractal program, because fractals have been around for a little while, but running them on a BBC Micro was not the most rewarding experience. But I could run a fractal program on the HPs, Hewlett-Packards. And actually the first time I met you, Ernest, I don't think you remember this, but I was sitting there coding away late one night and you happened to pop by and you looked in, you must have seen something interesting on the screen. And you said, oh, what's that? And I just said, it's a fractal. And that was our first meeting. Now, of course, you were head of department and I was a lowly undergraduate. So, you know, I was lucky to even have spoken to you at the time. So I started that. I worked with Steve for a number of years afterwards in a field called computer supported cooperative work. And that was really about using technology to enable creative people, in particular designers, to work together using technology. And clearly, for somebody interested in creativity, computer graphics, and these new networks that were coming along, it was a very exciting time. And I was very lucky to work with Steve for those 5-6 years at Loughborough. It also was the start of me actually thinking that what I was doing for fun, writing graphics programs and creating images, might be something that I would do more seriously later on. However, I wouldn't say I became what I would say was an artist until certainly the late 90s. It wasn't until the late 90s that I started to feel that my work was worthy of being called art. So in my archive, I have a few odds and ends of things, some of which were being done in Lucci. So the computer supported cooperative work, that is a picture of me taken from a video conferencing program called See You, See Me. And and I'd write software that used created shared drawing surfaces. We'd use CU, CME or video stuff for video links and audio links and so on. I also got quite excited by virtual reality, and I made my own homebrew virtual reality system that was set up in one of the labs using Nintendo Power Gloves and Sega glasses, and then some open source software called Ren 386. And of course, being in a university department, I had access to the internet, not the web, it wasn't the web yet. And so I was able to download open source and make use of it in interesting ways. There was also another interesting project, which in '94 was, oh, sorry, wrong one. In '93 was the HCI '93 conference. And I created a room at the conference full of virtual reality exhibits. I contacted all the companies and this, that, and the other. And I still have, this is the website I made in '93. And these were some of the systems that were being exhibited at HCI '93. And somebody else I knew, Chris Hand, who was at Leicester Poly actually, he had one of these homebrew VR systems, the same as me, so he brought his along. That was quite good fun. And we had commercial organizations trying to sell, which I guess you would call first generation VR, but compared to what we have now, it's barely the same. 3D graphics, I guess, is maybe what you might call it. But of course, being at a university at the time gave me access to this equipment, where really at home, you didn't have access to anything anywhere nearly as powerful or as innovative. It also made me realize that it definitely takes 20 years for a research technology to become potentially usable. So this work was being done in the 90s. Well, it certainly was 20 years before virtual reality started to meet the potential that we know it has now. Okay, so this is really how I connect early on to this story here. So arriving in Loughborough as an undergraduate and then working with members of LUCI on various projects, having access to the lab so I could do stuff in my own time. And then I became a research assistant working with Steve Scrivener for a number of years. Now, I then had a sort of, what these days I would now think of as a career break, but at the time it felt like a change of career, in that I did a lot of my own projects in the 90s while I was still at Loughborough, working with bands and doing internet related stuff and so on. And then eventually I sort of got snapped away by a company who saw these skills as being valuable. And for a number of years, I in the sort of 2000s, I moved away and focused on commercial web design. But actually, it didn't take long before I realized that while it was handy for earning a living, it wasn't what I wanted to do. So actually, by the mid-2000s, I'd also decided to go back to university, Camberwell in this case, and study for a master's in my own time while I carried on doing my commercial work. And then eventually that led me back to De Montfort University, Leicester Polytechnic, where I studied towards a PhD, and that's when I got to meet Ernest again. So now I was no longer the lowly undergraduate. We could talk almost as peers, and I was able to talk about the ideas that I had for making artwork that was based around systems thinking. Now, at the time, I didn't realize that this was an established art form, systems art. I hadn't heard of systems art, but I had a strong interest in systems thinking that I developed while I was at Loughborough as an undergraduate. And I'd have many long evenings talking to Julius Guzzi about this. He used to go on at me about being interested in somebody called Fridtjof Capra, and I was always telling him Fridtjof Capra said this about systems thinking and whatever. But it was very useful to have my ideas challenged. And what I realized is that the seeds really for what was to become my artwork was sown during the time I was working at LUCI. And so by the time I'd come back to De Montfort, I was clear that I wanted to create artwork based around systems thinking. And then as I got talking to Ernest, I realized that, first of all, I realized that he had been doing it since the 60s, and I hadn't invented systems art. And there was plenty I could learn by looking at his work. And then I also got reconnecting with Steve and talking about Stephen Scrivener's work. And of course, he was interested in systems art as well. And this was a conversation we'd never had when I was working for Steve in 5 or 6 years. But now I can see somehow the influence had sort of snuck into me, because things like homeostasis, the concept of homeostasis, is something I'm very interested in. Well, Steve has made work about that. The system, the connectedness idea really goes back to that paper Ernest demonstrated or showed that Stroud and Ernest had worked on. So for me, the interesting thing about being connected to this story is that I almost feel that after 30 years in, I guess, after it had started, I came along just at the right time to be talking about the ideas I was interested in with the right people to help me then move my own creative practice in a direction of which I'm happy with. And I think my work now is probably will be part 2 of this Leicester Digital Art Histories. I'll predominantly include it in the post-2000 stuff, but the seeds of it will be definitely sown well before then. So that's probably enough about sort of my work. If what I could do is briefly show, for those who don't necessarily know what I produce, is that my work is, I guess you might call it abstract, although I wouldn't call it abstract. It's typically made of color sorting algorithms that put things in their place according to rules and systems. And these systems are dynamic. And so even though I take stills from them, they are dynamic. So a piece like this, increasingly, I want to run them inside the browser, but not exclusively. So a piece like this, the system can actually, parts can be exchanged and the system will develop over time. And I might get multiple palettes like this that are organized according to the same rules, but start with different material. And a piece like this, where 3 independent systems are running inside this web browser, and they exchange colors when the circles reach the center. So it's like one is breathing out while the other's breathing in, and they form a network. If there was only one of these, it wouldn't work, because it requires a network of connected systems in order to function. And that's maybe a common characteristic of a lot of the work I do. It's the presence of multiple entities that enables the artwork to run. It can't just run by itself. And I'm currently working on pieces that run through, if I can unplug this one, might not be able to. Okay, well, I've got something here all based around microcontrollers so that I can potentially have hundreds of separate systems all interacting with each other over networks and whatever. So that was a little bit about why I included myself in the exhibition. I also wanted to make sure I could be on the wall with these other great artists. But a lot of my work is post-2000, although I am moving the collection into that direction. So in terms of what we might want to have a little chat about, it's clear that there's a narrative, a very fascinating narrative dating back over 50 years about digital art from people who came to Leicester, come from Leicester, were involved in universities in Leicester and Leicestershire. I'd be very interested in trying to really delve deep